now into the evolution of the Rootraces. So quite a packed class again, this one. The evolution of the Rootraces and the unfoldment of consciousness in humanity is a good meditation to dwell upon during this time. And I've touched upon it already in the previous 2 or 3 classes. And today we're going to go into the Rootraces in much more detail. In the chat, I posted a link to an article on my website that gives you a good summary of all the classes that we've gone into, not in so much detail, of course, but a very good overview. Time and history. The what's it called? The Re-establishing Esoteric Chronology in World History. So, of course, this material is in my book, Unveiling Genesis, Mysteries of the Rootraces and Cycles. And so much of this material is from that book. I showed you this diagram last week. The subrace of one root race seeds the next one according to the number of that race. So we have 7 branch races that make up a subrace, 7 subraces make up one root race. And there are so-called manus for each branch race, subrace, and root race. These are highly evolved beings that set the archetype or goal for that particular cycle of the branch race, subrace, or root race. So we hear the name of the Vaivasvata Manu mentioned quite a few times in the Secret Doctrine. The Manu of the 5th root race, so-called, but also the Manu of many other subraces and root races in various incarnations, if you like. So we have for instance, in the Lemurian column here, where my mouse is, if you can see my arrow, in the 4th branch race of the 3rd subrace of the 3rd root race, which is Lemuria, okay, the 4th branch race, that number 4, was the seed for the 4th root race per se, the Atlantean root race. And so that's why the arrow is moving from what we call 3.3.4, that is 4th branch, 3rd sub, 3rd root, to the 4th root. And likewise with all the other races, it's a numerical thing that corresponds to the rays, the 7 rays, and the quality of those rays pretty much corresponds to the quality of any septenary or any of these 7 branch races, 7 sub-races, 7 root races as a whole. For instance, the 5th root race corresponds to the 5th ray of knowledge and science and manas or mind, and the quite high development of that now in this 5th root race. Now, something I touched upon before, there are 2 main different types of souls on this planet. The ones who individualize on the moon chain, the previous chain to the earth chain, and the ones who individualize on the earth chain. But there are other ones around as well. So we have the Lemurian egos, which is another way of saying souls. Ego as in egg, as in causal body. These are the true earth humanity. Egos who came in on Atlantis, whoever they are, that's a mysterious passage. The moon chain egos I mentioned before from the moon came in on Atlantis as well. Egos from other planets or souls from other planets, and rare and advanced egos are awaiting incarnation. So something to ponder on there. And so here we have another blown up sort of diagram of the table we looked at before. And we have the 3rd subrace, 4th subrace. You'll notice that they're all bracketed, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th subraces. This was the period of individualization that began about 21.6 million years ago, okay? And it spanned a 3 million year time span, these three sub-races, that was the period when humanity was being individualized. Very long period by our standards, of course. And by the fifth sub-race, the individualization process had finished, but also it represented the splitting of the sexes of the previous hermaphrodite humanity into male and female. So with that number 5, the ray 5 of knowledge, we have the law of materialization. 5, the fifth ray is a materializing ray. And it also can be separative, and literally the sexes separated at that time. Great mystery, this duality that we inhabit on this planet. So these fifth and third subraces, 3, 4, and 5, was where the physical form, which was semi-etheric at that time, was being perfected. Now, I'd ask you to just hold up a bit on the questions, because some of them that are being asked I'm going to get to eventually. So we'll get to those questions later on. All right, so we have the souls individualizing here are the true earth-chain humanity. So we can see that the latter subraces of the Lemurian root race ran in parallel with the first few subraces of the Atlantean root race. And they actually fought with each other over a period of millions of years, actually, because the Atlantean root race started about 18.5 million years ago. 17 million, actually. I'll talk about that later, but a long time ago. But there were two distinct types of races. This is important. And these first few sub-races of the Atlantean root race, those egos which came in on Atlantis in point 2 here, plus the moon chain egos came in. They had to wait for a while until the so-called earth chain humanity had caught up a bit in developing their consciousness. But even then, the moon chainers were still far ahead in advanced consciousness, generally. So in Lemuria, in 3.5, the fifth subrace of the third root race here, almost immediately gave birth to the Atlantean root race. And as I said before, the C was in 3.3.4, back here, between the third and fourth subrace, where the fourth branch race, the third subrace of the third root race, was the seed planted that gave birth to the Atlantean root race. This fourth subrace per se, not the branch race, but the fourth subrace, is a very important one that has to do with the ancestors of modern humanity, in fact, of the fifth root race, like the more advanced races. Remember, 4 corresponds to the fourth ray, and therefore the major ray that rules humanity, in fact, the ray of harmony through conflict. So each branch race or subrace number refers to the quality of the one of the corresponding 7 rays being developed. For example, ray 5 of individualization. And ray 5, of course, is ruled by Venus. And at individualization, Venus was very present in its influence on this planet, along with Mercury. And both those planets are the esoteric rulers of Gemini, and which we're in now, of course. And Gemini itself had a lot to do with the bringing in of mind, as we call it, or the spark of mind on this planet. And so we have a little breakdown here. 3.3, the start of individualization, the great approach by the so-called Lords of Flame. And DK gives this figure, 21.6 million years ago. 3.4, the fourth subrace, the seed of the coming fourth root race, 20 million years ago approximately. 3.5, the coming of the hierarchy and the founding of Shambhala, the planetary crown chakra, 18.6 million years ago. And in 3.5, of course, we have the sexual separation and the final anchoring of the mental impulse, which took 3 million years approximately, from 21.6 to 18.6 million years ago, to be grounded in this bit. And in the first subrace of Atlantis, which corresponds to the fifth subrace of Lemuria, we had the physical plane headquarters for the mysteries in Atlantis 17 million years ago. So this is where the young fledgling humanity were being taught the mysteries, and in fact were being prepared for initiation. Remembering, of course, that initiation was a process started on this planet to accelerate human evolution because of the failure of the moon chain that we discussed last week. So again, in my book, Unveiling Genesis, I don't know whether you can see it clearly on here, whether it's in focus or not. No, not really. It's a great big thick tome. Oh, there it is. I'm starting to reread it again myself, actually. There's a much more detailed breakdown for those of you who want to dive in and explore that. So I touched on last week as well, the 333, the 444, the 555, third branch, third sub, third root, not just fanciful numbers, but actually key points of evolution, of the evolution of consciousness. The first degree initiation corresponding to individualization, the birth of the human soul. The human bodies were gigantic forms, somewhat clumsy and incoherent, and because the etheric wasn't quite coordinated with the physical. And so Hatha Yoga was the first yoga that was practiced at that time. We can only imagine the size of these giants. We are told by Blavatsky that they were 60 feet or 20 meters tall. Almost unimaginable. But there are proofs for this, and I also explain this in my book. We'll get into the giants thing a bit more later on. The 444, the deepest incarnation of the entire chain of globes, occurred in the fourth branch race, fourth subrace, fourth root race of Atlantis. Advanced civilization, the Great War and cataclysms that followed, the second degree initiation was to be sought by disciples and aspirants on the path of that time. Of course, corresponds to the emotional body. The Atlantean race was essentially emotional. They didn't think like we think today. Of course, the most advanced of the race thought, but most the polarization was in the astral body, and hence the race was psychic as well. And so that period was about almost 4 million years ago, 3.893 million years ago. And so we reached the 555, the fifth branch race, the Anglo-Saxon branch race of the fifth sub-race, the Teutonic Nordic race of the fifth root race, the apex of mental evolution, although a large proportion of humanity, possibly 70%, are still astrally polarized in Atlantean consciousness. But the ones who are polarized in mental consciousness carry it for the entire planet, so to speak. And so the third degree initiation, very advanced stage, and the mental body corresponds to this root race stage. Indeed, it is predicted in the next 2,000 years that many disciples will be ready to take the third degree initiation. But the second degree is the most difficult to take, essentially, the mastery of the astral body. Okay, so we are literally in 5.5.6, the sixth branch race at the moment now. We've already started that, and the United States is the leading nation of the sixth branch race. that will be the seed for the sixth root race, per se. So again, similar in these diagrams that you can ponder on at your leisure if you want to go back and look at the video, or in my book, you can see the time span allotted for each root race. For instance, the first root race, which was entirely etheric, of course, the Polarian, was from about 150 million years ago to 70 million years ago. Whereas the second root race, Hyperborean, is from about 79 to 27 million years ago. These are huge figures, I know. And that, of course, was also etheric, as were the first few subraces of the Lemurian root race, etheric. It wasn't until the third subrace, fourth subrace, fifth subraces that they became more materialized. Now, just to touch upon the yugas and the cycles, a big subject that corresponds to the root races, because the root races go over a period of time, or a duration of time. And so we have this table here of the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Vapara Yuga, the Kali Yuga cycles, and the years, 4,000, and the interim periods called the Sanyas or the Sanyansas between the cycles, and their total that correspond to here, led up to 12,000 years of the gods, the divine years of the gods. Well, a lot of Hindu scholars and Western scholars have taken this literally. It ain't so. This is one of the problems. People like Graham Hancock, for instance, and even David Frawley, the Western Hindu scholar, have taken these figures literally. They need to be multiplied by 360. So the divine total of years of the gods is actually 4,320,000. The so-called Mahayuga cycle is the total of the four yugas. And like all cycles, these yugas overlap each other. For instance, we're in the Kali Yuga of the fifth root race now, but the Satya Yuga for the sixth root race has already started. So we can't think in terms of linear back-to-back start and finish of cycles. We've got to think more in a spiralic sense. And so this 4320 is a special sacred cipher that I explain in far more detail in my book, and which crops up time and time again. So for millions of years, the two races of Lemuria and Atlantis evolved and mixed in parallel. They were instructed by the instructors of humanity to build their first boats, rock and lava cities, guided by these high beings. Yet there was also wayward behavior amongst humanity at the time, resulting in bestiality, the mating of humans with animals. And this was because they'd only, for several reasons. One was that they'd only just been recently liberated from the animal kingdom. Humans, before individualization, were basically part of the animal kingdom. They inhabited animal bodies, but they had no consciousness, like all the other animals, including the dinosaurs, of course. So there was a strong urge to merge, so to speak. And in doing this, they created the ancestors of the modern apes, of which the orangutan here is one of the most human-like of those remnants, and especially in terms of the fingers and the intelligence too, of course. So this time of individualization just after holds many mysteries and is explored in depth in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, and the eyes of them were both opened. In my book, Unveiling Genesis, it's two books in one, actually. And the second book in this big tome goes into an esoteric interpretation of all the verses of Genesis. And so Adam and Eve in the garden was essentially the individualization period, the eating of the apple of knowledge, the awakening of consciousness. And so there are various depictions of giants. The ones on the left here, much, much later. They're more later Atlantis and early Fifth Root Race, looking more like humans that we know today. This is an artist's imagination conception, of course, but it may not be too far from the truth. The image on the right was one generated by AI on Bing, on Microsoft Bing AI, uh, asking for a giant with an eye on the top of the head. And of course, it draws upon already existing artwork of giants that are on the internet. And so you get this, which I think is probably far from what they look like. But it is true, Blavatsky tells us, that the Lemurian giants, the ancient cyclops, the one-eyed cyclops, the eye wasn't in the middle of the forehead. It was on top of the head, in fact, towards the back of the head. And it eventually went back into the brain, and the remnants of that eye, what we call the pineal gland today. We'll get more into this later. This young lady here in the artwork, it relates to the passage in the Bible. The sons of men saw, what was it? Sons of men saw that the daughters were fair, or something like that, and took them for their wives. More AI-generated pictures of what it might have been like in ancient Lemuria. There's a dinosaur over here. It looks a bit fake, doesn't it? But it's, we can only imagine what it was like. And there are many, many graphic descriptions, in fact, throughout the Secret Doctrine on Lemuria, which I'm going to tackle in my next book, which is called Geography and Giants. It's the next in the series after this one. Individualization, Genesis chapter 3, verse 7 to 22. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Genesis 3:7, and the eyes of them were both open. They knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Well, there's been a lot of kind of religious Christian claptrap about the interpretations of the Garden of Eden. But of course, this does represent the splitting of these sexes into two sexes, male and female. We have the tempting serpent up here in the tree. We have the apples on the tree. We even have a stag here in the background, which may relate to masculine fertility. And of course, the tree of life itself. And I do spend a fair bit of time in my book going through this and all the passages that Blavatsky comments upon from the Secret Doctrine. So this is just a very brief touch upon that subject. All right, so now I talked about before how these root races, these manus, who are the archetype for a branch race, a sub-race, or a root race, are also actually the biblical patriarchs that we are familiar with in most of our Christian upbringing. Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, etc. We hear that Adam begat Seth, and Seth begat Enos, and Canaan begat Mahalalel, and so forth. There's a lot of begetting and begatting going on in terms of obviously human breeding and recreation and so forth. And these biblical patriarchs are very similar to the Hindu Manu names: Adama, Adam, Svetanama, Seth, Anuta, Enos, Kenasa, Canaan, Malahala, Mahalil, etc., Virada, Jared, Amuka, Enoch, Matashila, Methuselah, Lamaka, Lamech, Nayua, Noah. Now, we all know of Noah, and so in this table to the right here, we have the durations that are given in the Bible Adam lived to 930 years, Seth to 912 years, and so forth. And of course, Seth and Adam begat Enos. Okay, the fifth subrace gives birth to the first subrace of Atlantis. And so exactly what I showed you in the previous table. But these years don't add up, at least right now, on the surface to the timescales that are given. And so in this table, and this is another table from my book, you can see that the 1,000 years of an age of a patriarch, of Adam or a Seth or so forth, you see a lot of them live to almost 1,000, okay, equals 4.32 million years. This is the key that I broke, you could say, or turned in the secret doctrine that gave me the chronology for all the root races and sub-races, and also many other time markers that both Blavatsky and Bailey mentioned in their books. And so you can see these vertical arrows pointing down here at the age of 130 or 130 times time, a fraction of 4.32 million years. Adam begat Seth at the age of 105. Seth begat Enos at the age of 90. Enos begat Canaan, and so forth and so on. Now, you'll see at this particular one here, Jared begat Enoch. Enoch begat Methuselah at 65. And you see the duration of this subrace is very short. This is the fourth subrace of the fourth root race when the great war and cataclysm occurred. So anyway, that's another way to look at it. And you can see how the number 895 here, for instance, translates as 3.866 million years. Okay. So we may come back to that later, but back to the third eye thing again, which has been mostly erroneously depicted in art and in mythology, being in the brow. But of course, there is a third eye there as well. There is like an etheric third eye that is referred to. So in these latter subraces of Lemuria, 3.567, the Greek cyclops that talked about in Greek mythology represent, Blavatsky tells us, the last three subraces of Lemuria. And they were guided by the celestial beings and kings of the races, the so-called manus, semi-divine beings and divine beings, and divine dynasties that arose from these kings, these guides of humanity. These kings and rulers who had of mortal man only his physical appearance as it was then, but who were from spheres far higher and more celestial than our own, and will be Longman Vantaras or cycles hence. So these spheres are maybe other planets, but probably other globes and from other chains within the Earth scheme, as we discussed last week. There's life, many other lives within the Earth scheme per se, which of course is a reflection of the entire solar system and all the other planets. So we have these various statues and carvings and so forth. And so, and again, you see when you Google images of giants with one eye, you get this kind of thing, which are all over the internet, of course, have been for ages. Even though in ancient Rome or Greece, we still have these pavements depicting the third eye and the forehead. Now, the continent of Lemuria, like Atlantis, Lemuria was extent all around the world. So this is Lemuria, I can't read that, at one period anyway. And the dark shaded parts overlap the map of the world as we know it today, okay? So we have chunks of Lemuria up here in Northern America, Alaska, particularly, Northern Canada, California down here. And across here we have in the Gulf here of Mexico, we have a big continent, in fact, another continent over here. These were at different stages. So this is what my next book is going to be exploring, the various continents as they shifted and reappeared over periods of a few million years. Down here, the south of South America, over here overlapping Africa. And then you see right from Madagascar and Eastern Africa, right across Asia here, India, Australia, New Zealand. This is the greater continent of Lemuria, which stretched right across the Pacific Ocean and in fact touched California and South America at one stage. This map doesn't show them quite touching. So these maps have been drawn from some of Blavatsky's descriptions from Madagascar to Easter Island, Australia, and up to Sri Lanka in India. And 3.7, or the seventh subrace of Lemuria, did not die until about 4 million years ago. The Australian Aboriginals, the Bushmen of Africa, and the Vedas of Sri Lanka are the only remnants today of Lemurians, or maybe the Papuans as well, Papua New Guinea. And within about 700 years, Blavatsky tells us, they will have they'll have disappeared altogether because they've been subsumed or interbred with all the Western races. Let's look at these Easter Island statues, so-called Cyclopean architecture, the same in Easter Island as Tiahuanaco in Peru. Tiahuanaco to your right there. I went there back in 2012, I think. And so Blavatsky points out there's very similar architecture seen on Easter Island in terms of statues, artifacts, buildings, as in Tiahuanaco. And so that also may point to the fact that Easter Island, which is, I think, around here, where these couple of dots are here, was attached to the mainland, Peru, at one stage. I don't know, Easter Island might be down here, actually. So as I said, this is just Lemuria at one stage. There was a greater joining of the continent here that's showing a gap in this diagram at one stage. When you look at the South American llamas, the head of the South American llama, it looks identical to the Australian kangaroo. Very interesting. So there are many ways in the exoteric sciences to bridge the proofs of these ancient land masses. So Lemurian giants actually occupied Easter Island for a long time, but they were kicked off or displaced by Atlantean giants. There was a great battle between them, and the Atlantean giants took over and created these statues. Blavatsky does make a comment about these statues being Atlantean. And the height of these statues is about 27 feet or 10 meters, which Blavatsky also says was the height of the giants at that time. This is about 4 million years ago. Since then, they've excavated these statues, and there's just as much of this stone below the ground, revealing the rest of the body. So at this fifth subrace of the third root race, the first subrace of the fourth root race, there was the founding of Shambhala, the coming of hierarchy to guide the race. There was an organization set up for the mysteries, the guidance of the first degree initiation, these gigantic cumbersome bodies, the integration of etheric, physical, and hatha yoga as the discipline. And also it's mentioned in one of the Tibetan books that sex magic was one of the teachings for the infant humanity of the time. What we'd regard as sex magic today was part of the course back then. And here you have a idyllic piece of art of the city of Shambhala, which of course we know exists in the etheric. This Shangri-La, this great paradise that all of humanity are really seeking. So for those of you who have not watched my video, it's the best way to really access all this material. It's almost 3 hours long. I suggest you, if you do watch it, that you break it up and chew over it over 2 or 3 nights, evenings, or whatever time of the day that you've got available. That is the best way to get the overview of these several classes on esoteric history. You can find them on my website, the video section on my website, and also on YouTube. And I believe a couple of other places too. I can't think right now. Vimeo. I think they're on Vimeo too, on the Aquarian Wisdom Association website. So we look at this table before, just to remind us of the 3.5 subrace, the founding of Shambhala, 3.55.1, sexual separation, anchoring of the mental impulse, physical plane headquarters for the mysteries. And this was at a place called Ibez, I-B-E-Z, in the center of South America, which I have also other presentations that I've given about. In fact, there was a famous explorer that tried to find this Shambhala and it ended up being lost. So in the 7th subrace of Lemuria, the ancestors of the oldest races, the Hindus, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Phoenicians, and of course the Australian Aborigines that I mentioned before, and the others. The Lemurian race submitted to the animal nature. Venereal disease made its appearance. Eventually the entire race was riddled with it and died out. The hierarchy, or the guides of the race at that time, had its own methods of teaching these infant peoples. Humanity knew well what was evil because evidences were physically apparent. The penalty was obvious and the results immediate. The teachers of the race saw to it that cause and effect were quickly to be noted, cause and effect being karma, of course. So the animal nature was strong, and so the first disease, or the first miasm, if you like, for humanity arose in this root race, and that was syphilis, which DK talks about in esoteric healing in more detail, and I think we touched upon in our esoteric healing class. First tendencies to marriage came about in the Lemurian race as differentiated from promiscuity. Formation of family units became the goal for the most highly evolved. One of the first tasks undertaken by the hierarchy was the first effort towards any form of group activity, conveying the first lesson in responsibility. The segregation of the family unit and growth of sense of responsibility has gone steadily forward until it has culminated in our present system of marriage and our stress in the Occident upon monogamy. Yes, well, that's kind of broken down a bit in the last couple of centuries. So again, we remind ourselves of the cusp of the root races, third root race, fourth subraces, the of Atlantis, the so-called Giberim, Tlavati, the Toltecs, the Turanians. The third subrace of the Toltecs are actually the ancestors of the Chinese. Chinese are the oldest, second oldest race after the Lemurians on Earth. Very, very ancient. And of course, the modern China has a third ray personality, which corresponds to this third subrace. So we have other ones like the Mongolian, the seventh subrace, which actually does give, the Mongolian Tibetan, seventh subrace of Atlantis, and of course the stronghold of the ageless wisdom that the Tibetan monks hold. Then the Lemurian race steadily passed away and the Atlantean race came into existence. During the millions of years this race flourished on Earth, there were vast numbers of people with the Lemurian consciousness flourishing at the same time. Just as today, in this modern Aryan race or fifth root race, there are many, many millions of people who express the Atlantean consciousness and are polarized in their astral bodies, the victims of emotion, the consequent dilemma. In the Atlantean race, the physical duality was then solved, and the physical body and the etheric body constituted a unity, and in the healthy person still do so. The sense of duality shifted then into a growing recognition of the conflict in the realm of quality and into the field of what we call today pairs of opposites, good and evil, pain and pleasure, right and wrong, sense and nonsense, and the multiplicity of opposites by which the aspirant today is phased. In old Atlantis, the consciousness thread began to function in a way unrealized in Lemuria. Sensitivity, awareness, and as a result, desire and reaction were the keynotes. So we have to bear in mind that as the race slowly passed away, human beings gradually diminished in size from root race to subrace to root race to subrace since that time, just as the dinosaurs diminished in size to the size of lizards that we see today. There is the parallel, but unfortunately, modern science doesn't take that into account. It looks at the diminution of the form, size of the form from dinosaurs to modern lizards, but not from gigantic humans to modern humans. And my proposal in my book is that they both diminished in size in parallel with one another over millions of years. So, and also because of the consciousness factor, that the consciousness was much more evolved in Atlantis than Lemuria, then the bodies became smaller and more refined, more coordinated, until there was a point in the middle of the Atlantean root race where Blavatsky virtually describes the giants that were like gods because they not only had this perfection of form and beauty and refinement, but also the consciousness to go with it. And not all of them were well motivated or selflessly motivated, so to speak. And this led to the creation of the Great War in Atlantis. So in Atlantis, the astral vehicle was a controlling factor. The mind was relatively quiescent, except where the foremost members of the race were concerned. They were extremely psychic and mediumistic. They were sensitives in the modern use of the term. The state of awareness was astral. As a race, they were clairaudient and clairvoyant. They were in no way able to interpret that which they contacted. They were not able to distinguish astral phenomena from ordinary physical life, particularly in the middle period of their racial history. The interpreting mind revealed nothing to them. They simply lived and felt. Such was their life history. Two of the threads were functioning. One was not functioning at all. The bridge was not built. So we're talking the two of the threads being the consciousness thread and the life thread. The bridge is the anticoronal, of course. a state of immature development from the angle of our modern standards and of the basically emotional and physical focus. Magical ability, they had the magical ability to subdue and control the subhuman kingdoms and the elemental forces of the planet. These are two angles which have been but little studied. Of course, we have the magic of the Australian Aborigines, the American Indians, later on, all the ancient races knew how to do this, and much of it would be considered black magic today. In fact, the development of black magic in Atlantis and the crime of theft were the key factors that led to Atlantis' downfall. So there was the possession of a physical third eye down to the middle of the Atlantean rootrace. The perfection of the human anatomy made it disappear outwardly. So basically what happened that from about, I estimate, from about 17 to 14 million years ago, the eye at the top of the head disappeared back into the brain, and gradually two-eyed sight grew out of the brain during that period. But in the interim sort of cuspal period, there were three eyes functioning, one towards the back of the head, and the two new eyes that had grown out of the brain. This is a great mystery, but Blavatsky does say this, so I'm basing this on what she has said. And so, again, the eye and the forehead, as depicted in this picture here, may be inaccurate or untrue. So, because of this eye, this one seeing eye, because in the Lemurian giants or cyclops, they could see all at once in all directions with this eye. It was both a psychic eye and a physical eye. So you could see behind yourself, you could see 360 degrees. Quite an interesting factor. It'd be nice to have one of those eyes. And because it receded back into the brain, the hierarchy had to psychically awaken the race artificially, in a sense. So psychically, spiritually, the perceptions lasted until the end of the Atlantean race, a psychic race. But they died out due to abuse of other functions, sex, theft, etc., abuse of the psychic function and mental development together. The Atlanteans were artificially awakened psychically when the third eye atrophied. In other words, it atrophied, it withdrew back into the brain and became the pineal gland. And we still see this ancient development in the young baby where the fontanelle, and you can see it pulsing between the bones of the fontanelle and the skull before it closes over after a few weeks or a few months, I believe. You see the back of the pineal gland. About this time, the two physical eyes grew out of the brain and superseded the third all-seeing eye. So for a while, there were three-eyed beings. By the way, we get to the fifth root race per se next week in more detail. But you can see the sub-races there, the first Hindu, second Egyptian, Mayan, third the Arab Semite, the fourth the Celtic Latin, fifth the Teutonic, so forth. So I'll jump back to that question about the Turanians. Well, yeah, Irina says, because can you clarify the real origin of the fifth root race, since there is between the Toltecs and Turanians? That's right. Toltecs, Turanians. Well, in that other pattern, in that other table it was, but it's got the correct arrow here. what happened in the other table, that the arrows drifted when I copied and pasted it. It wasn't a fully integrated diagram. So sorry about that. So the fifth subrace of the fourth root race was the seed of the first subrace of the fifth root race. But actually, like before I described, it occurred when I talked about Lemuria and Atlantis. It actually would have been 4.4.5, the fifth branch race of the fourth subrace of the fourth root race, that the seed of the fifth root race began. Daniel says, what was the name of 4.5? Well, we're not sure. There's a few here that are not clear. We're clear about the Mongolian Tibetan. I've got a question mark here next to the sixth one, being the Etruscan. These other names, Giberim, Tavlati, Toltec, Turanians, they are speculative from, I think I took some of that material from A. Powell, a theosophical author, and also Leadbeater. But I think the Toltec is probably the most definite one there. That's something that is a long-term project of mine, to really explore these subraces a bit more. It's a hell of a lot of work to really trace it all back. But anyway, time is getting way away in us. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to move on a bit. The one-eyed Cyclops, the giants fabled as the sons of Coelus and Terra, 3 in number, according to Hesiod, the ancient Greek historian, were the last 3 subraces of the Lemurians, the one eye referring to the wisdom eye. The 2 front eyes were fully developed as physical organs only in the beginning of the fourth race. The allegory of Ulysses, whose companions were devoured while the king of Ithaca was saved by putting out with a firebrand the eye of Polyphemus, is based upon the psychophysiological atrophy of the third eye. So you'll see many different artworks of Polyphemus the giant. You can see the sheep he's just about to have for dinner. And a couple of small humans down here in the corner, while these other humans up here have got a firebrand that are burning his eye out. So it's a very symbolical, very esoteric part of Greek mythology that's talking about a much later time. The early civilization began to demonstrate its own note to set new standards of material comfort and of selfish control on an increasingly large scale. As the urban existence and dense population developed, the animal nature was dominant, tendency towards sexual relationship, large families, etc. Only people with a true measure of intelligence were disciples and initiates, and they guided and guided the infant humanity like parents do to children. The hierarchy were incarnated as priests and kings, looking over humanity. But essentially what happened, the Atlantean, given that 444 symbolism, 4 being the number of matter, and the deepest incarnation into matter for the entire globe and chain, the moon chain karma came to a head. The failure of the moon chain karma, you see, had also crept in when the moon chainers came in the early subraces of Atlantis. So a huge boost of intelligence and technologies and so forth, but also a real materiality of coveting what other people owned. You know, remember the old, one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. This is an old Atlantean crime. And because of that, just like with the unregulated sex impulse in Lemuria that created eventually the disease of syphilis, so the disease of tuberculosis came during Atlantis, as I'm just paraphrasing here one of the quotes that DK gives, that those who persist in that material acquisition of things will find themselves short of breath and their breath or their lungs failing them. That's the rough translation. And hence, and of course, we have tubercular diseases today, do we not? And probably just as extreme materialism as a recapitulation of the Atlantean era. As I do discuss constantly in my newsletters, various inventions by the use of instinctual masses of men in building great and beautiful cities and stupendous structures, the remnants of which persist until today, under the expert guidance of the initiates and their adepts who employ their knowledge of the nature of matter and energy to produce much that today man is gropingly endeavoring to discover and make possible. So there were these marvelous cities that the grandeur of which dwarfs what we have today, apparently, even the ancient Greek times. Scientific discovery, but a lot of it was given to humanity as a free gift by the hierarchy. As people today give to a child of beautiful and wonderful things which the child uses and enjoys. But like anything, things can be abused, and so the child that plays with matches and sets fire to stuff gets the matches taken away from them by the parent, and likewise many of these scientific gifts to humanity were taken away from them. But today, as we move into the Aquarian age and the development of the fifth aspect, the fifth root race, humanity is rediscovering all those things which were taken away in the past, but in discovering them for themselves. They're not gifts this time. They're doing the hard yards, so to speak, to develop them themselves, and already are abusing those things too as we go into the Aquarian cycle. Great and beautiful cities full of temples and great buildings, of which the Chaldean and Babylonian remains are the degenerate remnants, and the modern skyscraper, the child, were everywhere to be found. Most of our modern scientific knowledge was possessed by these priest kings and constituted in the eyes of the masses a form of wonderful magic. Sanitation, hygiene, means of transportation, and air machines, or Vimana, what we call UFOs, were developed and of a very high order. All gifts from the hierarchy. So there are various artistic renderings of Atlantean cities. In fact, as I discuss in my Unveiling Genesis book, there were certain templates of Atlantean cities that were repeated in various continents of Atlantis. And I stress again that people who talk about the lost Atlantis as being in one place is a misnomer. The Atlantean civilization was spread in the eastern half of the United States, South America, Central America, in the middle of the Atlantic, right across the Indian Ocean, in India, in fact. The Mahabharata, the Great Atlantean War, was fought in India. And here it is there, with the warring armies of Krishna, of Arjuna, and his charioteer, Krishna. The cleavage between the two groups, the one expressing the forces of materialism and the other the energy of light, grew gradually wider until towards the close of the Atlantean age, it was so wide, and the lines of demarcation between the two schools of life and thought were so clear that a crisis was precipitated in the then civilized world, of which the present conflict, World War II, is a definite effect. The great war between the forces of matter and the Great White Lodge, like a white magic, essentially. It came to a point where the hierarchy said, more or less said, that they had to draw a line in the sand. This is the way of light, that is the way of materialism. Humanity, make your choice. So it was the hierarchy's decision at one of their centennial conclaves that forced this conflict to take place. And in a sense, the hierarchy won, but they also lost. There are some contradictory quotes about this in the teachings, where DK says that the hierarchy were forced to withdraw, and that this is almost 4 million years ago, remember, and they are seeking to reappear in the next few decades after a few million years absence. Hence the importance of this time now, because we are still recapitulating this Atlantean conflict with the same forces ranged on both sides. And of course, in this fifth subrace, it's the five is the materializing ray, as I said before. So it is very materialistic, and the misuse and abuse of science is rampant. And so DK talks about the initiates in Atlantis and those who hadn't really worked for initiation, the two groups of light and darkness. We don't really have time to discuss that, but you can come back and look at this and read this on the video. In our recent movies of last century, we had the Harry Potter movies and Voldemort. We had the Lord of the Rings and Saruman as archetypes of the dark forces that were ranged against the hierarchy. Both stories, well, particularly the Lord of the Rings, of course, as I say quite often, is straight from the racial memory. Tolkien wrote, as an initiate, I think himself, drew from the racial memory and told that story complete with monsters and trolls and so forth that all existed back in those times. So it was the masters facing the same sixth initiation, the initiation of decision, who decided to bring that ancient civilization to a close. They therefore sacrificed the form aspect of manifestation and created a situation in which the soul of humanity was liberated from the prison in which it found itself. So millions of people were wiped off the face of the earth just after this war in the great first flood of Atlantis, the first of four floods, almost 4 million years ago. The last one being about 13,000 years ago. Quite extraordinary. And Nicholas Roerich depicts that flood in one of his paintings here. Of course, we have lots of symbology and many other photographs and paintings of the flooded Atlantis. And there are hundreds of places around the world that archaeologists are aware of, that Japan to Central America, off the coast of India, hundreds of places have got these ruins and remnants. The war was ended by the intervention of the planetary Logos himself, and that ancient civilization went down into the deeps and was engulfed in water, a symbol of purity, sanitation, and universality, and therefore appropriate as an ending for what one of the masters has called a tubercularly oriented race. Death by drowning. So just as the solar Logos interfered in the moon chain, so the planetary Logos, in a sense, recapitulated that act in the middle of the Atlantean Rootrace. And so we have here this area of southeast India, or southwest India, I should say, was where the Mahabharata was fought out. The left and right hand paths, white and black magic. Dwarka, Haryana, these areas around here. Lots of submerged ruins there too. A rough map of Lemuria at one stage and the fact that it joined onto southern India. This was in fact the origin, this landmass here, the ancient Tamil Nadu, which the Tamil Nadu state today reflects, to encompass Sri Lanka, is the origin of where the ancient Egyptians and ancient Mayans originated. Yes, Daniel says Dwarka has been found a few years ago. Thank you. And we have other photographs of these ruins. Extraordinary. And we have another map of Atlantis at a certain stage. So you can see how the Americas here, the United States, and South America are virtually obliterated by the old Atlantean continents. I said the eastern part of the United States before, but this map is going right across the western part as well. You can see how Atlantis spreads over Europe, the Middle East, over India, Asia, right across Indonesia. Okay. So again, at one stage, there's about three major phases of continent shift, sinking and rising, between Lemuria and Atlantis, and between Atlantis and the present Rootraces. The forces of light triumphed because the hierarchy was forced to intervene potently, and with the aid of certain great lives extraneous to our planetary life, they brought the Atlantean civilization to an abrupt end after a long period of chaos. This took place through the medium of culminating catastrophe which wiped hundreds of thousands of human beings off the face of the earth. This historical event has been preserved for us in the universal flood legend of the Great Flood. But elsewhere, as I said before, the Tibetan says that the hierarchy were first withdrawn from human contact. In fact, they'd withdrawn from human contact before the flood, but they were working behind the scenes prior to the flood and during the flood, of course, and after the flood. And so this brings us to Noah's Ark, which we will discuss next week. Basically, the entire world was flooded. There were only mountain peaks that were poking up above the ocean, where survivors had found their way to. Noah was the incarnation of one of the Manus. He was the Manu of the fifth subrace of his father was it Lamech, I think. Noah is the Manu of the fifth Rootrace. And whilst the story of the ark is symbolic, it's actual too. I think there was a physical ark that gathered all the remaining survivors of the flood, went around the world and gathered them all up, along with animals too. But the essential symbology of the animals going onto the ark 2 by 2 is more about humans being rescued. And the Manu brought them back to a place somewhere in the Himalayas, we're told, and basically worked on them, or bred them, if you like guinea pigs, for a few million years, and created the first subrace of the fifth Rootrace, which was the Hindu, which is the basis of all Western races. And they came down from the Himalayas into India, we're told, about 1 million years ago. So extraordinary timelines there, and which we can elaborate upon and go over again next week. And such a potted history of such an extensive millions of years. I've just given you a few highlights here. Again, please read my article that I gave you the link for in the chat, and or watch my video, The Hidden History of Humanity, which went viral after a couple of years, and much to my surprise, serendipitous surprise, and which many people have watched. Well, one person said he's watched it 50 times, but many people have watched it dozens of times, and you'll get something each time that you watch that. It's fairly detailed. And if you want even more detail, then, as I said before, the Unveiling Genesis that I keep on plugging, Mysteries of the Rootraces and Cycles, or the deep, in-depth scholar